Hello, welcome to this week's episode of The Board. I'm Gavin, Agile Coach, and today we're going to be talking about, we've been getting this question a lot. We've put out an Agile survey and we've already surveyed 45 people, and one question we're getting a lot is, does Agile mean no documentation and no preparation?
Hi, I'm Kirsten. So this is a commonly held misconception about Agile, the fact that nothing's ever written down and we don't prepare. Because of the lack of lengthy functional specs or requirements, there is a view that perhaps there isn't enough preparation. So I mean, starting with preparation and getting started on a project, what sort of things do we do using Agile practices that's different from Waterfall? I mean, some of the things I can think of are deliberate discovery, for example.
Mm-hmm. So like usually you have a session of something like user experience mapping or something along those lines. Like Gav, you went on that course with Jeff Patton.
That's right, yeah. He explained the whole story mapping process to us, which we do a very similar thing to here. We call it user experience mapping.
Yeah.
And that's just where we get a group of subject matter experts and customers if possible. It's quite hard to get customers in sometimes, but they're absolutely essential to the process. And we ask them to write out on post-its every little step they take when they're using a bit of software or using a website, whatever the project is going to be. And everybody does this and lines up all their little steps chronologically. And we distill these into overarching themes, I suppose, and then we get them to write features to support these themes. Yeah. And this is a 2-hour workshop, and it's pretty high intensity for the 2 hours, and you really have to corral people when you're doing it, because people tend to go off topic and get a bit distracted, or else people come in with preconceived notions of what they want. So
I mean, sometimes when you're about to do these, people say, you know, what can I do in preparation for this workshop? And we always say, please don't do anything, right?
Yeah, no preparation. And with the focus being on you know, working out what the features that they require for their minimum viable product. Is that right? I mean, that's what we're trying to achieve.
And
yeah, exactly.
But also really thinking about it from the user's perspective, what the user will do within the system, rather than, you know, perhaps a list they've compiled back at the office of things they think they might need. You know, if you can put them in the shoes of the user, then they're going to come up with, you know, a minimum release that's going to be useful things for user.
Well, that's right, yeah. One thing we get them to do a lot of the time, in fact all the time at these experience mapping workshops, is to create personas. And we get them to prioritize the personas as well. So you might have, you know, Ben the businessman and Sally the saleswoman, and we get them to assign these features, or what features might be of most value to each of these personas. And then they also decide when they were planning out, say, release 1, release 2, release 3. Release 1, we might concentrate on one persona and what features meet the needs of the most important persona. And it's just a good way of getting people to think about what other people want and get rid of their preconceived notions. And by the end of that workshop, you have enough information to actually start work the next day.
It's a really quick way of getting started, isn't it? Rather than doing, say, months of functional spec writing or whatever else people have done in the past.
It's a very dynamic. Every workshop I've participated in, they've all been very dynamic, and everyone, include, you know, from the business side, has been really animated during the
Definitely.
process.
I think it helps that you get them standing up, though. You know, it's something about standing up in a room rather than just sitting down for 2 hours. Really energizes people and gets them thinking.
That's right.
And it's more interesting for them, obviously.
And so usually the upshot of that is user stories, isn't it? They're high level. They can be high-level user stories. They can be features, if you like, or epics, but it's generally we're generating user stories.
Exactly.
Which are our requirements.
And which is the preparation that we do for starting the first sprint, and then subsequent sprints there'll be more stories written in the intervening period, right? So, you know, that is a form of preparation. It just doesn't happen to take months and months, such as the requirement writing might have taken on a waterfall project.
That's right. That's right. And it's accepting the fact that things will change and new ideas will emerge and so on during the process, and not being bound to one specification that was written 3 months before the project started. That kind of thing, you know.
And I think that's the most important element of that whole myth about documentation not being used in Agile. It's just that we don't try to write all the documentation up front. We don't try to guess what's going to happen, because stuff is going to change, so you're just going to end up rewriting documentation and wasting time doing stuff like that. You just want the documentation to be minimal and to write it throughout the project, not to do it all up front.
And I think sometimes the documentation isn't obvious to people. There's lots of different types of things we do that produce documentation. It just doesn't look like things used to look. So for example, we were talking yesterday about acceptance test driven development.
Yeah, that's right. So we had a quick discussion because it's interesting. The Agile Manifesto talks about working software over documentation, and of course, the whole point is it doesn't mean there is no documentation. It means we prefer working software. And so a lot of the way that we design and build our software uses test-driven development, and test-driven development is a way of specifying. There's specifications of your code before you build the code.
But the difference being that it's just-in-time specification.
Just-in-time specification,
yeah.
and it's a form of documentation that, for example, with acceptance test-driven development, we sit down with the product owner, for example, and we will go through and write scenarios with the product owner. They're use cases, if you like, for the software. They're how a feature is going to work, and it's a very important part of understanding for both the developer and the business.
The product owner.
And
tell me, what do you think? Does it take a particular type of product owner to sit down and write those tests with, or is it simply a matter of educating that person on how to do that?
It depends on how. Sometimes the product owners are really familiar with the business and how it works at that level of detail. But then sometimes there's a business analyst, or maybe more. There's more than one supporting the product owner. So it may be that you sit down with a business analyst, but it's someone who knows the business well that you want to sit down with, and you're asking them to describe the domain.
So they don't need any technical expertise? They
don't need technical expertise. The way we write them is all plain English.
So really they just need to know their own business, which presumably...
Yeah, totally, yeah, absolutely.
And do these scenarios get turned into tests?
Yes, they do, yeah. And they almost word for word will be is the output that you'll see on the screen.
So this is Cucumber that you use for this, is it?
That's right,
yeah. So they are written in plain English.
Yeah.
If I do this, this will happen, kind of. Yeah.
So you write down the feature that you're testing, a bit of background. Usually there's some setup, so you'll assume something. You're making some assumptions.
So the user's logged in already, for example.
The refinery, or the content management system's already set up. Blah blah blah. And then you describe the scenario. I want to order an image, and then you go through the steps. And the steps are written in a way that they're actually as if a user was clicking on various parts of the page, filling in form fields, clicking buttons, checking boxes, and so on. Because
that's what actually happens when you run the test at the end, isn't it? It fires up a browser and then runs through automatically.
That's right. I mean, usually it's what we call a ghost browser, so we don't actually see the browser at all. But you can switch the browser on and you can watch it.
So you can do if you want, but there's no need really.
And clicking through and make sure it's doing exactly what you want it to do. So it's all automated. But it's as if you've got a user running through your system, and you're just describing, those tests describe how the user will run through the system and what they're going to fill in and what checkboxes, buttons they're going to click as they go.
So how does this work with test-driven development, and what's the reason for doing both of those types of development?
Well, acceptance test-driven development is the higher level, so it's looking at the integration of the. So we're looking at how the entire feature works, if you like. Often when test-driven development is done at a lower level, and they're what we call micro tests.
Right.
So they are specs that they're specifications around certain parts of the program doing certain behaviours. So i.e. you're testing a specific function that calculates the cost of something. You're testing that it calculates the cost correctly.
Rather than a whole feature, for example.
That's right. So you're writing a series of micro tests which test that particular. It's a function. It's usually at a function level, or a module level. Whereas integration or acceptance test-driven development is looking at the entire feature, so that across different components of the system. I.e., I've got to log in. I've got to do this. I've got to navigate to this page. I've got to add items to my cart. I've got to check out. Go through the checkout process. It's usually the end-to-end test for acceptance test.
So what are some other types of documentation in Scrum? I mean, one that I can think of straight up is stories. Stories are basically requirements written on a feature basis. Right?
Exactly, and the acceptance criteria are being modified throughout the project, and the story is always changing. It's not fixed, so you might write a bunch of stories up front, but these stories are just starts of conversations, so they're not set in stone, and will evolve throughout the project as well, which is, I think, a pretty good example of documentation in
of course, once the feature's been accepted and released, that story stays the same, and that, you know, if you wanted to go back and look at documentation, would serve as a requirement.
And a lot of systems, you know, electronic online systems that people use to record their stories in, have got ways of attaching the tests that you're running against those stories, and and also whether the tests are you know, passed, whether there's any defects associated with that story, and so on. And so you've got all of your documentation attached to that one.
Does Rally do that?
Rally does that. Yeah. Rally.
Okay. So then you've got the full picture around each feature.
That's right.
In terms of documentation.
Yeah. And then, of course, when things change, and you probably would write another user story to enhance or do some further development work on that. And of course, you've got all of the acceptance tests.
So you can go back and look at those and what needs to change. Can you use those as a basis for the enhancement, or do you write entirely new tests?
Of course we do. Yeah. We just build on those. Yeah. We're just building on an existing design. So we'll just write, we'll either change,
modify,
or adapt, or write further acceptance tests.
So really, the backlog, say if you had a done column in your software, that's showing the history of previous development on the project.
I mean, yeah, exactly. I think one of the standout examples of when this works so well is, for example, when I was working with a government department recently, and they had the specifications for their system were so far out of date. They've got a very old mainframe, and the software that's written on that has been you know, updated over a number of years. But keeping the specification documents up to date was obviously a huge task, and they hadn't done it. And so when the business analyst was coming to work out how the system worked, she was going through the specs, and the developers were saying, that's not how it works. Because
it had changed so much and no one had made updates.
So they actually found the best way to deal with that was for the business analyst and the programmer the developer to sit down together and go through the software and see actually how it worked, so that she could then write the appropriate specs for it.
Yeah, that's a good idea. We've just had a comment from Julian saying that the definition of done is a great piece of documentation.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what are your thoughts on?
So we have those artifacts that we generate. You know, our definition of done, our team charter.
I think those things are really good if you can make them visible throughout the project, because you know, I have seen them be forgotten about. You know, so if we can do things like stick them in visible workspace.
Well, they should be visible. We had an internal project, and it was for the Boost website, and we changed Scrum Masters on it, and the incoming Scrum Master, Joe,
standing over there,
asked us where the definition of done is, and it was a little bit embarrassing because we couldn't find it, because it was an internal project, our own website. I suppose we had let that lapse a little bit.
Had we actually done one?
We had done one, but we had to.
It wasn't posted in a very obvious place, was it?
No, so we had to search for it a little bit. But definitions of done, and we do it in all external projects. But even if it's internal, it should be visible, and people should know exactly what criteria each story has to meet. It's a fantastic bit of documentation, definition of done.
In project terms, other terminology that people are used to for definition of done is non-functional requirements, essentially. It's the qualities, we were talking about this earlier, the qualities of the project that you're
and the operations of the system.
That's right. And so most people will call that non-functional requirements, we call that.
Okay, and I mean that gets added to as the project progresses as well. So if there's something that's been highlighted, say a performance issue that could possibly go in the definition of done.
I've been asked a lot about non-functional requirements in projects that have been on, and how do we actually capture these. I'd be interested to see how other people capture them. We usually just capture them as stories, because they are, and they're sized, and they're prioritized.
And not all non-functional requirements will go into the definition of done. That's the
that's right.
Performance stories, for example.
Yes.
Will often come at the end of a project, or so at certain points within the project. You know, when the product owner wants to test that the performance is still acceptable.
Will be revisited after launch and things like that as well. The launch of a site when they're doing enhancements.
I was reading the Scrum Field Guide,
Were you?
Yes, and there's a good analogy for documentation in Agile, which uses, for example, say you're a sports writer and you're going to go to a rugby match. You don't write the full story before you go to a rugby match. You don't predict the score at the end of the rugby match, and you don't predict all the plays that are going to be made throughout the game. You can do a lot of research before the game, and you can see how the teams are performing and how they've done against each other historically. So you can probably get some facts out there before the game starts.
Yeah.
But all the information comes out while you're actually on the sideline taking notes throughout the game, and only at the end can you actually state what the score is.
So you could provide some context prior to the game within the article.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is is analogous to a project, isn't it? Because quite often when a business analyst is looking at a business case, they do provide context for that. But I guess traditionally, they've quite often provided a list of requirements as well, whereas what we prefer to see in the way of briefs or business cases or whatever you like to call it is a description of outcomes that they want to achieve with the project rather than specific features. And then of course a bit of context as well as to how this has come about and where the needs have arisen from.
Of course, the beauty with these kind of micro requirements that we generate user stories is that they're easily updated and easy to keep up to date. And of course, we accept the fact that when we move on from that user story, it's how it was, but it's not necessarily how it is because there's other user stories that follow it to
sort of qualify it, basically.
Yeah, that's right.
And Paul, I have a question for you. Earlier on, you mentioned deliberate discovery.
Oh yeah.
Which is something I've never come across myself.
Really?
So
Okay.
It's just
something new every day.
It's just that phase that we're talking about. Sometimes when you have say you've got some significant features that are coming up that need a bit of they need a bit of extra work, so you sit down with the team and you'll have a design phase, if you like, through, and usually the team and the product owner will sit down and they'll whiteboard things up about how these particular features are going to work. It might be around architecture that's the deliberate discovery is being done, but it's usually around a significant piece of work that's being introduced.
I think we quite often see the results of it on the whiteboard in the big room there, don't we? We're like, do we still need this? Is someone taking a picture of this?
And if you like,
almost like madness.
It's a process that we go through just to help our product owners understand what user stories they need to write.
Okay.
That's all right. So you can do it at the beginning of a project, but you can also do it during the project as well.
So what are some of the other things, Paul, that developers do in the way of documentation around code and things?
Sure. Well, for us, it's the specifications are the main. We know if a new developer comes along to the project, or you're working out how a bit of software that you've not worked on works, the specs are the first place you go, so the tests. But then the other things we write we'll have readmes that tell you how to configure the software. Release notice or release notices.
What sort of things are being a release notice?
So it's often when you're pushing software out externally. So for example, one of the projects we're working on is being open sourced, and so we'll include a release notice then, and then it's just what the major features are that are included in that, for example, and how certain expectations and within how the software works and so on. So
like when I update my apps on my iPhone, and it gives me what's changed since the last update, so I can make a decision about whether to update it.
It's a release notice.
Yeah.
I was reading something recently as well about a team that were working they'd just gone Agile, and one team had finished one feature and they were passing that feature over to another team, and the other team that was receiving this code was freaking out because there is minimal documentation, and they weren't used to that because the way they used to work had pretty comprehensive documentation. So one way they dealt with that was to have the two teams get into a room together for a workshop just to discuss things very quickly and bash things out in a couple of hours, and also swap one team member with another team member so that you can sort of share that knowledge across the board. And I just thought that was quite interesting because you do have just what you need documentation, so that's just one way to handle stuff like that.
So those conversations would then give the documentation more meaning.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a handover.
And just make the handover a lot more smooth, really, and just make sure that everybody's working off the same page as well.
So I mean, it's really encouraging that collaboration and face-to-face communication as well. Because obviously if you're looking at documentation cold without any communication, there can be some, you know, sort of interpretations that may be different from the intention of the person that's written it. So you really do need actual communication as well as those notes, right?
And there's a very interesting talk that I was watching during the week by Mark Kearney, who's this guy. He used to work for Atari, then he worked for Sega, now he works for well, he's contracted to PlayStation, and he's the lead architect behind PlayStation 4. And his talk's quite interesting because he discusses how when he started off and in Sega they spent months and months creating lots and lots of documentation, and this documentation would keep being revised, and they all just realized, wow, we spent months making this documentation and haven't produced any software or any hardware whatsoever. So
sounds like an epiphany.
Yeah, it is a bit of epiphany for them, and that was, I think, possibly in the possibly late 80s or early 90s that happened, and they realized that they didn't need that much of documentation. They could minimize that a little bit. But one thing they also talked about was that they, when building the PlayStation 3, the people who were building the hardware had no communication with the people who were going to be building the software whatsoever. So when they actually released PlayStation 3, it took 4 to 6 months for people to develop stuff for it, or to even get an understanding of how to develop stuff for it. So for the PlayStation 4, they merged those people together so that they can actually work together and collaborate all the way through it. So he wasn't, the talk isn't about Agile or anything, but he certainly, some of the things that they've noticed is some of the problems that they had in the past were fixed by doing things in a more agile way.
Do they also talk about, or even unknowingly, about some lean principles during that as well? You know, taking things to users quite early, like with test groups and things like that. Did they do anything like that?
No, they didn't. They didn't really discuss stuff like that. I suppose the reason why they didn't discuss stuff like that is because it's. It's so top secret and under wraps. It is top secret,
but they could still have, a user group. I mean, quite often people select a user group. They'll have them sign NDAs or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And to test that real, end users, gamers that are interested and keen. You know, there's no reason why they shouldn't do that.
No, I suppose not. And maybe they do that, but it certainly wasn't discussed in this talk. But and everything in that whole console world is so super top secret for obvious reasons, I suppose.
Yeah, it's not a word I'm really in, but I'll take your word for it.
And I suppose in that sort of world, we're going off topic slightly now, but it's hard to test with the end user because they're making a lot of assumptions, and they're releasing, for example, when the PlayStation 4 or if that crappy Xbox comes out, they're going to have a bunch of release titles and the hardware, so they're going to release the hardware and the software at the same time. So it's they're going to be making a lot of assumptions about what gamers and end users actually want.
I mean, presumably they know a bit about it.
Well, yeah, they've had a lot of experience, I guess.
So I'm just going to bring you guys.
Oh, you're going to bring it back to
okay. Sorry
other forms of requirement. Other forms of documentation we have in Agile. I was thinking, like, was the board? I know it's a fairly transient kind of place.
This board or the visible workspace?
The visible workspace.
Yes.
Right.
Yep.
But that's obviously a form of documentation. There's some artifacts on there that we have, like the burn-ups.
And having the tasks as well. I mean, obviously they're all in the electronic version, but it's great to have everything that out there and people can see it, including product owners, team, colleagues.
And it's a very visible form of documentation because, and I've experienced it a number of times when people from the wider organisation have walked past the board and looked at it and gone, wow, that's interesting. Oh, you guys are doing this, and this. I didn't even know that was on the agenda. And got really involved in and suddenly become a kind of stakeholder within the project because they've suddenly realised that there's so much going on that they didn't know about before. You know, and the visible workspace just opens all of that out. So it's not, it isn't top secret within the organisation. It's actually very visible.
It's heaps more engaging than having to go off to a piece of software yourself and find something. Obviously, just walking past something is much easier to engage with it, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah.
And if you ever see, if you ever go into a company, say, where there's 1 or 2 teams doing Scrum and nobody else is doing that, they're just working in a more traditional way, and you can tell what those 2 teams are working on and what the progress is and exactly what stage they're at. But the rest of the teams, you walk into the room, you have to actually
talk to them,
delve in a lot, to talk to people.
That's right.
We have to delve in a lot deeper. So these visible workspaces, even if you've got nothing to do with that company, you can still walk in and have a quick look and see what they're working on. It just gives that transparency instantly.
for example, we had this is part of a government department project. One of the guys was coming from the PMO, I think it was, but he was basically interested in the risk aspect of the project. And so he just came along to our stand-ups every day to see he could quite clearly get the information he needed from the board
for his reporting,
for his risk reports,
report up. Yeah, so he didn't need to have like long reports from the team written on email or anything like that. He could get it quite quickly in that 15 minutes.
Yep, that's right, because he could see what was blocked, what wasn't.
Saves so much time,
which bits of software were being built. He could see its steady progress. Once he understood the definition of done and so on, meant that once we got to the end of the, through each column of the Scrum board, it meant we'd finished that piece of software and it was tested and ready to go. He realised that he could, just tick things off and monitor the progress of the project without any significant.
So he could see the benefit of that pretty quickly, I'd imagine, once he understood what the board was and how it worked.
I believe he went off and trained up as a Scrum Master after that project.
Nice.
Actually, one thing just occurred to me, the preparation we do for this show.
What preparation?
Well, it's minimal. I suppose we prepare for this in an agile way. We sit down and we discuss what topic we're going to talk about, and we write out a few touch points on post-its, but we don't. It's pretty obvious, I'd imagine, but we don't plan things out too much about the show. We just.
We don't. I'd say it takes us about 10 minutes on a Wednesday, late Wednesday, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Generally.
Just so we have enough to know what we're generally going to be discussing.
Yeah. It works very well. I mean, it works well, I think, to have that sort of freshness, and maybe that's similar on projects rather than sort of getting bogged down in loads of detail. It keeps people quite engaged if they don't really know what's coming up, actually.
And one thing that we did when we were discussing stuff in that 10 minutes prep for this show, Paul mentioned system metaphor, which is another term that I'm not
so we often
very clear on.
That's for developers again. So it's a way of designing a system so that you develop a common language. We call it a domain-specific language sometimes around the software that you're building, so that when a developer comes to read some code, they understand exactly what's going on, because it's written in this using a metaphor that's commonly understood, it's a common.
Have you got an example to help us with that?
Well, the one I always use, which is pretty lame, I think, is the library. If you're writing a system for a library, but and you want to, you would. You'd write a module which is called borrow or something like that, and then you'd have a function which is called borrow book, for example. But you're using the way that you name your software modules and the way that you name your functions are all specific to library or using library terminology. So search by ISBN, for example, would be another name of a function.
It's a bit like a taxonomy for coding. Yeah.
That's right, exactly.
An agreed taxonomy.
Yeah. So you and the system metaphor is just what you're agreeing as a team to use as your analogy to the software that you're writing. It's usually like I say, it's specific to the domain that you're working in, and it's usually you end up generating what we call this domain-specific language. Makes your code much more readable. So the documentation you need around your code is fairly light. We well comment our code, but we don't have documentation. We have specifications in the form of tests. We have comments within our code. We have a system metaphor which helps developers pick up that code. I guess the only significant piece of documentation we do generate sometimes is the user documentation at the end of the project, or during generally we're on the long running.
You mean like how to?
Your user
guides.
You're preparing bits of user documentation every time you release new software, essentially. And what we find with our users, for example, the project we're working on has been going on for several years, is that we just give them the information they need, and they will. I've got no idea what they. Well,
they'll put it into form that's appropriate for them, right?
It's usually on a wiki.
We can't really guess that.
We usually use wikis, and they usually use wikis as well, for example. So they have that's where their user documentation goes. I mean, I know you guys have different experiences with some of the projects.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes we use things like Basecamp to build up that documentation. And sometimes, at the end, you might put it all into a Word document and send it over or something like that. I mean, there's different ways of dealing with it.
The ideal is that your software is so usable that the user experience has been so well designed.
I mean, it depends on the project, though. If we were doing a Drupal project, for example, the back end is fairly controlled. There's not too much we can do with that.
That's right.
So I think we're coming to the end now. So, I mean, to sum up, yes, Agile does have documentation and preparation. It just only has what's necessary.
Yeah.
And so that principle, working software over documentation, just means we prefer working software over writing documentation.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean we don't write
It
documentation.
doesn't mean we don't write documentation.
It just may not look the same as other documentation.
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone. Thanks for joining
Thank
us.
you. See you next time.